Thanks for everyone for joining today. I understand that some of the people who have joined might have some experience with architectural preservation. Some of you may have not. So for this discussion, I'm going to talk mainly just about my experiences in the Audubon Park Historic District, which was landmarked in 2009, as well as, so that was a success. I'm also going to talk about something that so far has been a failure, and that is to expand the Audubon Park Historic District to include 158th Street, which was left off when it was designated. Then I'll talk a little bit about identifying some strong candidates for designation, some allies who can work with you, how to promote your initiative, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. But as Diego just said, if you have a question at any time, please type it into the chat window and I'll keep an eye on it every now and then. If I see a question that I can answer as we're moving along, I'll be happy to do that. So let me just start off by saying that I am not a trained preservationist. I'm not an architect. I'm not really have any sort of background, educational or work background that would really make me qualified to be working in historic preservation, which may be true of many of you who are on the phone. However, I have been exposed to architecture and history all my life. My father was an architect. My mother was an English teacher librarian. Their idea of a fun thing to do in the spring, summer, and fall, sometimes in the winter, was to take us to all the historic sites in Virginia where I grew up. And my father talked about the architecture. My mother talked about the history. They both were interested in history, but particularly my mother talked about the history. And so I had this very early grounding in buildings and the built landscape, which I'll talk about that particular term in just a moment. My first job out of college was restoring a Victorian mansion in Richmond, Virginia on Church Hill, which was, this was back in the 1970s, and Church Hill was in the process of being restored. It had been a neighborhood that was very popular in the 1890s. We'd gone through several different transformations, and a lot of the houses had been divided up and they were coming back as single family houses. Then after that, I had the great privilege and pleasure of working for one of Richmond, Virginia's preservationists, Mrs. John H. Bocock, Elizabeth Bocock, who was very early in preservation. She was working on Church Hill and in other parts of Richmond, saving buildings in the 1960s, even before the Landmarks Preservation Commission was created here in New York City. So she was very forward-looking in many aspects of her life. She was, I think it's fair to say, she was a very wealthy woman, and with many of her friends who also were wealthy, had a really good strategy for saving buildings. They would buy them. That's not always possible for us, of course. Actually, usually it is not possible. So we have to go about other means of preserving buildings. So back in 1999, I started working with the Audubon Park Historic District initiative and helped with the RFE and helped to promote that by developing a website and by doing community promotions. And so that's really sort of my background, how I got into preservation. And I'd say I got into it as much from architecture, as much as from history as from architecture. So let me just go for a moment to this built landscape term. What is built landscape? And it's really anything that we do as humans to humanize the landscape. That is the things that we build, not just buildings, houses, office buildings, but also roads, sewerage systems, even telecommunications systems. Anything that we do that's imposing ourselves on the landscape, that's the built landscape. And that's what we're dealing with when we are working in architectural preservation, is the landscape that has evolved over a period of time, usually over a longer period of time, and that we are trying to preserve in some form. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll just talk about the steps that you go through in preserving or in getting a designation in New York City. The first step is to write a request for evaluation. And you're writing this to the Landmarks Preservation Commission. They have a form on their website that you can use, or you can do something a little bit more involved if you want to. But you must start with some sort of request for evaluation. Then you submit that to LPC, Landmarks Preservation Commission. It's best to submit it with letters of support from your community, letters of support from your community board, and from your elected officials. And then after you've submitted that, you do follow up with additional letters of support, maybe get some media coverage, some social media coverage, and I'll talk about ways to do that a little bit later. You might hear pretty quickly from LPC. The times that you hear most quickly are unfortunately when they are rejecting you. Or you might hear that they are calendaring you. To be calendared means that you are put on a calendar for discussion at one of the regular meetings of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. They will have hearing and testimony. This usually takes place over the course of more than one meeting. And eventually, usually if you're calendared, unless there is some major objection, there is approval that follows. There's certain exceptions to that, but most of the projects that I have seen calendared are eventually approved. Once the Landmarks Preservation Commission approves a designated building or area, a historic district, then it must go to the city council for approval. That's why it's really, really important to have buy-in from your council member before you even start the process or before you submit your request for evaluation or early on, so that you'll know that you're going to have that person working with you to give you support. In Northern Manhattan, we're working with Mark Levine, who has been extremely supportive, as was Robert Jackson before him. Robert Jackson was our councilman at the time that we were doing the Audubon Park Historic District. So let's move on, and let me just go through the steps. I've described the overall steps. Let me talk a little bit about the Audubon Park Historic District, which is, as you can see on the map there, that is west of Broadway, pretty much the buildings between 155th and 158th. Down there at the bottom, you see the Audubon Terrace Historic District. That was designated back in the earlier years, 1979. It's a group, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's a group of museums that were created and built with the funding of Archer Huntington, the first one being the Hispanic Society, then Numismatic, and then he moved off from there. As I say, that was designated in 1979. In the late 1990s, a fellow who lives at the Riviera, which is 790 Riverside Drive, named John Esmond, noticed the sign for the Audubon Terrace Historic District and said, well, how did they get to be a historic district? And he went to HDC and asked about the whole process. And so they were partners, HDC that is, were partners with John and with me when I joined the process right from the start, and really guided us, helped us to write the request for evaluation. We began writing it, researching and writing it in 1999. We submitted it in 2003. We did a lot of follow-up between 2003 and 2009. In 2009, we received the designation. Now, we say we did a lot of follow-up. We did a lot of community outreach to get letters of support. I developed a website, the Audubon Park website, which is audubonparkny.com. And that has expanded over the years to serve other purposes. But originally I built it to draw attention to what we were doing and to inform people about what the buildings were that we were trying to get designated. As I say, we were designated in 2009. When we submitted our RFE, the request for evaluation, we included mainly the buildings along Riverside Drive, which you can see there on the map, between 155th and 158th, and the ones on the side streets. When we took this, or when John took it actually, to the community board, the land use committee suggested that it be expanded all the way up Riverside Drive up there to 160th Street. So it would have included those John P. Leo row houses that you see there on 158th Street. You can see that on the map. And all of those other buildings stretching up Riverside Drive to 160th Street. When LPC reviewed this, they sort of took a compromise between the two, and they took the original buildings that John had suggested, and John and I had suggested. They are on Riverside Drive and 156th and 157th, but they also added the buildings on the other side of Riverside Drive, which were built at a later period, and they added 2 buildings there at the corner of 158th. What they were doing was building a corridor there along Riverside Drive so that you had this vista beginning at 158th, whereas you went up Riverside Drive, you had the buildings on either side, and you could see up those numbered streets, and it all worked together as a very cohesive landscape. They left out, as the John P. Leo row houses there on 158th, which is what we'll talk about next. So if we can move to that next slide, at least I believe that's what it is. Yes. There at the bottom, you see a picture, a photograph of the row houses. In about 2015, my neighbor Vivian Ducat noticed some advertisements for 2 of the buildings on that block were for sale. And she became very concerned because it looked like that there was a developer who was interested in them, and there was a possibility that they might be demolished. They were not contiguous. The house that was in between them, which was not for sale at that time, but has been on and off the market since, also had a lot behind it which could be developed. So Vivian's fear, which was certainly well placed, was that a developer could buy one of those houses and tear it down and use it to reach that blank lot behind, because the lot as it is doesn't have access to the street. But if you bought one of those houses or 2 or 3 and use them as access, you could get access to that building. It would give you quite a bit of space that you could develop in a building that might go pretty high up in the air, and would be really out of context with the buildings in the Audubon Park Historic District and the Audubon Terrace Historic District. And so Vivian began working with a group of us. We prepared a request for evaluation for the expansion of the Audubon Park Historic District. We applied to HDC, and we were designated one of the 6 to celebrate that year. Diego mentioned 6 to Celebrate a little bit earlier. Let me just say a little bit more about it. It's a program where HDC chooses 6 places each year that are trying to be designated as landmarks or as historic districts, and gives support, not necessarily financial support, but gives the support of their vast wealth of knowledge. They help to promote it. They sponsor walking tours of the areas that are being, the RFEs are being submitted for. And they provide a wonderful brochure, which is a sort of a self-guided walking tour of it. So they really help you get some visibility, and the staff there is all available to give you advice on steps, what to do next, what to do when LPC says yes or no. It really helps you along. We also, back to talking about this expansion, we got strong community support. We had, I think, between 100 and 150 letters, closer to 150 letters of support from members of the community, as well as people outside of the community who were interested in supporting this expansion of the Audubon Park Historic District to include these houses. The Audubon Park Historic District had all 3 of the characteristics that LPC looks for in a designation. That is, we had interesting architecture that was representative of a specific time and place. It had an interesting history, and it had an interesting cultural aspect to it. Audubon Park was a neighborhood from the 19th century, second half of the 19th century, that grew out of a farm that John James Audubon had owned, that evolved into the Audubon Park neighborhood, and then into it urbanized at the turn of the 20th century, at which time the name Audubon Park pretty much disappeared from use until we had the designation in 2009, and it became quite popular again. And many people now speak of living either in the Audubon Park Historic District or the Audubon Park neighborhood. So as I say, we had strong community support. We had really strong support from CB12. The Land Use Committee at CB12, which is headed by my neighbor at the Grinnell, Wayne Benjamin, is very supportive of all of the efforts of historic preservation in northern Manhattan. They gave us advice as well, as HTC did, and also, as I say, had been supportive and written letters and really done everything they could to support the initiatives I've been involved with. We've also had strong support from our elected officials. I mentioned Mark Levine, our councilman, earlier. We've also had strong support from the borough president's office. The borough president, again, is very supportive of historic districting and landmarking in all of the boroughs of New York. So we submitted our request for evaluation, and LPC refused it, initially because they said the row houses were a different format from the apartment buildings in the designated historic district, but also because, as I mentioned earlier, you had that corridor, that Riverside Drive corridor, and they didn't feel it was part of it. So we have revised the RFE, and we have submitted it in a couple of different ways. We initially submitted it as an expansion of the historic district, so then we submitted it as a standalone historic district, and that was rejected as well. I think we've had 4 rejections, but we haven't given up, and we keep looking for different ways to present that block, either as a standalone or as part of the Audubon Park Historic District, or we've now come up with another possibility for it. And if we move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about that. There is a house at 857 Riverside Drive, which is now under threat of demolition. I don't know if some of you on the call may live near here, or you may have walked by here. It's a very interesting house, sort of stuck in between apartment buildings on one side and row houses on the other. The house itself actually dates to 1851. It was built at the same time that Minnie's land, Audubon's farm, was evolving into Audubon Park. And it's quite possible, based on the historical information we have, that John James Audubon's son, John Woodhouse Audubon, if he was not the builder himself, advised them on building it. And the reason I say this is because the original structure, and you can see a better picture of it there on the lower left, was the same Italianate Victorian format as many of the houses in the Audubon Park neighborhood. And again, it was built in 1851 by a man named Dennis Harris, who owned the property. Dennis Harris and the Audubons knew each other. Harris had actually bought some property from the Audubons. And this was, as I say, the same time that Audubon Park was evolving. We know that John Woodhouse Audubon designed and built many of the houses there. And so it's quite logical that he might have built this one. Beyond that, there's a strong connection between the house and the Underground Railroad. Dennis Harris, who owned the land, was an abolitionist. He owned also a sugar refinery, which is an interesting dichotomy, because when you think of the fact that refining sugar the whole process of refining it was built on enslaved labor, and yet he was an abolitionist. He was also a Methodist minister and a bricklayer, a man of many talents. But Harris also was very active in the Underground Railroad. His refinery on Duane Street was a known stop in the Underground Railroad. And it's quite possible that he used his refinery at 162nd Street on the river as another stop because it was closer or farther from the center of the city. So after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, when slaves were by law, escaped enslaved people were by law to be returned to their owners or the people who believed they owned them. This became a much more dangerous situation in the city itself. And so having this other stop at 160th Street on the way to Canada would have really been a help. Harris, as I say, built the house. He sold it to a man named John King. King sold it back to him about a year later. For 2 years, it sat vacant. Again, it was those years between 1852, 1854, when it might have been used again as a stop in the Underground Railroad. And then a man named John Newhouse bought it, who was also an abolitionist. So we have some really, really strong ties there for this house, not just historically being part or a neighbor of the Audubon Park Historic District, but also culturally, the fact that it could have been part of the whole Underground Railroad. So there was an initial RFE written. It was really beautifully written. I took part in helping supply some information for it, but I read it, and it makes a very convincing case why the house should be saved. LPC refused it. In this particular case, because of the architectural integrity of the structure that remains. As you can see, the veranda there, the porch is gone, the cupola is gone, the windows have been altered, there's a new facing on it. So it doesn't have a lot of the original architectural features, and so LPC has refused it on those grounds. They did acknowledge, however, their interest in sites related to the Underground Railroad, and so they are interested in that aspect of the house, though not in its architectural integrity. However, that initiative continues. There's several possibilities. One is to develop a larger historic district that would include those houses I was just talking about on 158th Street and all of the buildings between 158th and 160th on Riverside Drive, which, if you remember back there at the beginning when I was talking about the CB12's land use committee, that was an area that they wanted to have in that original Audubon Park Historic District. So this could be perhaps a standalone district of its own, which would include this house and help preserve it. The initiative goes on, and you can read more about it, I believe, on Facebook. There's a group called 857 Riverside Drive. I believe that's the name. If anybody's on the call who's working with that and could put in the chat window something about it, that'd be very helpful. I appreciate it. So we've looked at a successful designation and two unsuccessful ones. Now let's go on and look at, just talk a little bit about historic districting north of 110th Street. We are really underserved. This is true in Harlem as well as in Washington Heights and Inwood with historic districts and individual landmarks as well. I took this little table that you see here off of Wikipedia. You can go to do a Google for designations, historic preservation designations or landmarks north of 112th Street, and you can come up with the same table. And you can also find either on LPC's site or on Wikipedia, there's a lot of information about where historic districts are. There are not nearly as many here in northern Manhattan, and the reasons are many. I would say that probably the biggest reason is that during the early years, the late 60s, the early 70s into the 1980s, when the LPC was doing designations, they were focused on the areas where they were getting the most interest. And northern Manhattan at that time was not really an area that was focused on historic preservation in the 60s late 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were greater concerns that community leaders had as far as quality of life issues and dealing with crime, with drugs, and other things. They were really focused on preserving lives more than on buildings. And so they missed out on that earlier period of designation. So what you see is during that period, the areas that did receive designations were things like the Audubon Terrace Historic District, or buildings such as the Church of the Intercession, Morris Jamel Mansion, Dyckman House, branches of the New York Public Library, places that had advocacy, people who had the time and the energy to advocate for them, to write the request for evaluation for LPC and to follow through and get those designations. So now, in the last couple of years, LPC's focus has been on the outer boroughs, much less than on Manhattan, and not particularly on northern Manhattan. So this is both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge, of course, is to get LPC's attention. The opportunity is that there are many areas, and I hope that there are people who are on the call today who live in an area that they think might be a good candidate for a historic district, and you can start the process and start following through. So exactly what is it that you do when you're identifying a site? Let's move to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit about that. And again, this is based on my own experience. And I'm sorry, I just realized that I didn't size this slide very well, and architecture's E is on the second line, but I hope you'll forgive me for that. In architecture, you want the site to be as pristine as possible. As we saw just a few moments ago, LPC's main objection, at least the one that was in the rejection letter to 857, was the fact that it is not as pristine as possible. It's missing some of its earlier architectural elements. And we had a little bit of that pushback on 158th Street. Some of the buildings on 158th Street, some of the row houses there, which originally had front steps, for example, up to a stoop, now have an entrance on the first floor. And some of the architectural elements have been stripped. However, there's really a lot of the block left there, but you can see the original intent and get an idea of what that block looked like. It should also be a distinctive, identifiable style. And again, I'll go back to 158th Street. All of the buildings on all of the houses in that row, all 12 of them, were designed by the same architect, and they were built in the same period. There were two owners, but one architect, John P. Leo. And so there is an identifiable style there. You can go along and you can see that you've got the four later ones built are 2 and 2. And then you have another design of, I think it's ABBA, BBC or something like that. I can't remember right off the top of my head, but you have a definite cohesive style and format there. History is another aspect that you can bring to the fore when you're doing your request for evaluation. How does the building or the group of buildings fit into New York's history? Where does it fit, for example, in the urbanization process? Those are not the only things to look at, but those are just two that we've looked at in the particular designations I've worked on. And then you have culture. Who built it? Who lived there? Who worked there? What happened there? I have worked with Save Harlem Now, which had a designation in the last year. And actually, I meant to mention that when we were looking at that list of the historic districts north of 110th is not complete, because there is the Central Harlem Historic District, which was designated, I believe it's last year, and the Dorrance Park Historic District, which was the year before that, which both represent, again, these elements here that I have on this particular slide as far as interesting architecture, history, and culture. So those are things to keep in mind when you are looking at a particular building or group of buildings and want to submit an RFE. Then you get to that point, and let's move to the next slide. You decide you've got some An interesting idea. What do you do next? Well, you can go straight to the Landmarks Preservation site. They've got a form you can fill out online and get the process rolling. That's one way to go about it. I would also suggest that as you're working through it, take your time if you can, and contact the Historic Districts Council, contact your community board, the land use committee, contact your elected officials, and let them know what it is that you're doing. HDC, as I said earlier, really with the Audubon Park Historic District, walked us through every step of the process. It was really a wonderful resource to assist with our strategy, to assist with our research. And as I mentioned earlier, they now have these Six to Celebrate awards, which gives you access again to the staff there at HDC, who are really wonderful help. Your community board in Northern Manhattan, as I mentioned earlier, Wayne Benjamin is the head of the land use committee and is always a wonderful resource. He's worked with, Wayne is an architect himself, has worked with a lot of historic districting and knows the ins and outs and sort of strategies to really help you along. And our councilman, Mark Levine, Borough President's Office, again, are good allies to have on your side. I've listed some other organizations there too. Save Harlem Now, which I just mentioned. I've served on the board of Save Harlem Now for a couple of years now. They've had a successful designation and are looking for partners in other designations. There's Yuen Chin, who is a seasoned preservationist. She runs Harlem One Stop, as well as does a lot of other things. My neighbor, Vivian Ducat of the Riverside Oval Association, has been really the energy and the major force behind expanding the Audubon Park Historic District. So whereas none of these people would necessarily be working primarily with your recommendation, your request for evaluation, they all have experience and might be able to give you some guidance or partner with you on your idea. So once you've put together an RFE and you have sent it in, what are some things that you can do to help promote it? So let's look at this next slide. Some promotional tools that I've used and the groups I've worked with have used are things like social media. As I mentioned earlier, we have the Audubon Park Historic District website, and I'll just put in a little plug there. You can see over on the right, there's the cover of my book, Audubon Park. The Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot. Don't even know the name of my own book. The Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot, Audubon Park and the Families Who Shaped It, that actually grew out of the whole process of researching and working on the historic district. But that website really did help us to promote the idea of a historic district in the community and to get support for it. You also can use social media. I have a couple of screenshots there from Save Harlem Now's Facebook page, Riverside Oval Association's Facebook page, and Harlem One Stop on Twitter. All of those are really valuable for expanding your network, finding support, and finding ideas. One of the things that grew out of the Audubon Park Historic District website was the number of people who contacted us who had ancestors who had lived there, who had photographs or information that they were happy to share about what had gone on in earlier years in that particular neighborhood. Your print materials are also very valuable. My friend Leslie Doyle is online, and she has on the call tonight, and she has worked with the Tin Pan Alley designation, which went on quite a few years, and developed some really wonderful materials for it, and went into schools actually, and has developed a whole school program around the Tin Pan Alley, what is now the historic district. So print materials are also incredibly valuable. You want your support letters, and one piece of advice I'll pass on is that 10 letters seem to be more impressive, not just with LPC, but just in general. 10 letters seem to be more impressive than a petition with 10 signatures. Now, how to get people to write those letters? So the easiest way is to have a form letter that they can put in some of their own ideas on, or just sign. That way, you've got the letter already written, and all you really need to do is get a signature and some extra comments if people would like to give them, and then you can submit all of those letters with your request for evaluation. Flyers, of course, are also important printed material that you can use in neighboring buildings to promote what it is that you're going to do. And don't underestimate the importance of having community meetings, or of course now Zoom meetings until we can all meet physically again, but group chats, anything that can promote your idea and get support for it. So that's really the things that I wanted to convey to you this afternoon. It looks like it's about 10 minutes after the hour, which gives us about 20 minutes if there are any Q&A. And as I said at the top, I'm not really an expert. I've just done this some. And so I might have some answers for you, but I see that there are, as I mentioned earlier, some of my preservation acquaintances on the call as well. And so if I don't have an answer, maybe one of them could as well. Let me scroll back up and see. Diego, did we have any questions that came in on the chat?
Not on the chat, but if anyone has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Or if you want to type a question on the chat, please feel free to type it.
Right, it looks here like somebody asked about the presentation. You can certainly supply the presentation, and I think it has my notes in it, and so I will have a lot of what I said in the presentation as well. Was there a question that came in?
Well, it seems like there are no questions.
Matthew, this is John Rumley. We live in Washington Heights.
Hi, John.
And Vivian Ducat has helped us with the history of our co-op, which turns 100 years old. So it was kind of interesting. It's one of the oldest middle-class co-ops in the city.
Yeah, sorry, not just the building, the co-op itself.
Yeah, it was converted to a co-op in 1920, and there was a landmark legal case that allowed an eviction in that effectively, then as now, there was a prohibition on a state prohibition on evictions because rents were rapidly rising after World War I.
Right.
And our building was converted, and 53 middle-class people bought the shares, but only 28 of them were in the building, and the rest of them had to be evicted. And so there was a major case, and the litigants won, and the people had to leave or buy.
Right.
And that made the real estate news because suddenly people who wanted to sell their buildings in a very tumultuous market where there was essentially rent control was imposed, or suddenly we're converting these buildings to cooperatives. And it wasn't just fancy rich people on Park Avenue that were doing these co-ops or artists that were doing co-ops. It was middle-class folks. So that makes our building, but architecturally, our building is not particularly interesting. It's a George Pelham building. He did many, many buildings in Washington Heights. I guess there is a question coming out of here, which is a lot of the institutions, the large property owners, and I'm thinking of the hospital and the university, would probably oppose historic designation because it ties up their ability to renovate or substantially alter these buildings. Would you not say that's true?
Yes, it is. There was a preservation conference that Yuan Chin, whom I mentioned earlier, sponsored. I think it was maybe 3 years ago now. And one of the interesting things, one of the speakers had a picture of a map of Broadway and said, here is Columbia University, and here is Presbyterian Hospital, and everything in between will eventually be part of Columbia. And you know, it's sort of like going from the two ends towards the middle. But I don't think that that prevents a historic designation, or should I wouldn't take that um, as a reason not to try. The history that you were just talking about is really fascinating for several reasons. One, George Fred Pelham did, I think it, off the top of my head, I'd have to go back and check, but I think he did 6 buildings in the Audubon Park Historic District.
I think 4, maybe
4. It is 4. It's 4.
And then 2 more up Riverside Drive. You're right. 6 is
right. But he did 4. Thanks for correcting me. That's 4 in the historic district itself. And interestingly enough, he designed more that weren't built when the Grinnell, and I cover this in my book, another plug for the book. When the Grinnells were thinking of leaving, they commissioned him to design apartment buildings for the property they had left, but they never built it. Anyway, so there's that. That George Fred Pelham was prolific in northern Manhattan, along with Schwartz and Gross and all the other names just went on my head. But anyway, so there's that. But then the story you were telling us about the cooperative is really fascinating, because the first building I lived in the neighborhood, Audubon Park neighborhood, was 780 Riverside Drive. And that same process played out there a few years later. And so from what you were telling me, I didn't realize that this was sort of like a trend all over the city. In that particular interest, 780 and 788, there were cooperatives that formed within the buildings. A certain number of people owned the buildings. And if you wanted to move there, you had the option of renting or buying.
Yes, those were hybrids, and that was a popular way. The building owners or rather the developers who built this, they weren't they weren't in the landlord business, and a lot of people, right. A lot of landlords weren't going to get into buying houses in the middle of or buying buildings in the middle of a rent freeze. And so the cooperatives was a win-win situation. People could avoid rent increases, and other people would they could, and the builders could get at least some cash out and move on to their next project. I guess what's interesting about Washington Heights north of us is as each individual building is not a particular landmark per se, although some of them are really good, by Bloom and Bloom and a few others, and Pelham. But as a district as a whole, it's a very interesting, simpatico, homogeneous district of 6-story buildings. And there's merit in that, I guess.
Well, there is. And again, one of the things that LPC mentioned in their designation, and one thing I'll go back to, I didn't say this earlier. Oh, and I see that, I see Vivian's there. Hi, Vivian. But one of the things that LPC wrote about in the designation report for the Audubon Park Historic District was that cohesive fabric. And that's something that they really look at, that you have a sense of place when you're walking along a street, for example, and as you were just saying, the buildings all tend to be a similar height and the windows are sort of lined up with each other. This was all a characteristic of the Beaux-Arts style, where you didn't have just a building by itself, you had a group of buildings that all acted together to create that sense of space. That's one of the things that makes Audubon Terrace so beautiful, is that most of them were designed by the same architect, Huntington's cousin. But the last ones were not, but most of them were. And so that's one of the things that can work in a proposal to really help sell the idea to LPC.
And two avenues in particular, which were not commercial avenues, and so the first floors were not badly damaged, are Wadsworth and Fort Washington Ave. The buildings are a little bit better. They're a little fancier. They were appealing to a slightly more affluent group, but it's all middle class housing. The apartments may have been a little larger as well, but those are two really, I think, eligible streets to start with in Washington.
And I think another aspect of those that's really important is that they were housing for many of the Jewish families who were fleeing Nazi Germany. You can find this in the census records um, by looking at 1940, and there is a column in the 1940 census which asks, where did you live 5 years ago? New York State used to do from 1845 until 1925 did censuses on the fives. So you could look that up in the New York State Census. But they didn't, they stopped it. And so they didn't have one in 1935, but they did have that column. And so you can see in, for example, the blocks across from the Audubon Park Historic District, 155th to 158th between Broadway and Amsterdam. You can see scores of families who listed their residence as Germany or Austria in 5 years earlier and who had escaped after Kristallnacht and before, people couldn't escape any longer. And I think that's an interesting cultural aspect that you could bring out also on those blocks going north.
And in our building, we took two snapshots of the census, the 1920 and the 1930. 1920 being before the conversion to co-ops, and 1930 being 10 years after the conversion and after the Depression. And you're absolutely right. The 1920 shows a lot of Eastern Europe and Germany, but the predominance was moving into New York from other parts of the country, moving into that building. So they were leg up. These people who were buying the first were in these middle class apartments. By 1930, you're absolutely right. A lot more Eastern European. And what's interesting is there were a number of lodgers in the building, and
Right.
tenants who were boarders, probably because and fewer servants.
Right.
Because of the financial crisis.
Right, exactly. And you'll see this is true, not as much inside the Audubon Park Historic District because those apartments seem to have been a little bit pricier. But again, looking across Broadway, you see a lot of families sharing apartments, which again was when you had an apartment that had two entrances, say for maids